This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. As Joe said, my first book was on Atlanta, and a lot of it was written here at Emory. I lived in town for 2 years and spent, I'd have to say, at least a year somewhere in Woodruff Library, either in the basement or up in the special collections. And it's terrific to be back home to give this talk. It is intimidating to give a lecture that is named after such an eminent scholar and that has had a string, but I did not realize the star power you've had here. I'm sorry it's an off year for you this year, and you're stuck with me. As Joe said, this is part of a new book. This is the very first presentation I've ever given off this project. So there's going to be rust. I look forward to your questions at the end. Again, my title today is One Nation Under God, Corporate Interest, Christianity, and the Rise of Religious Nationalism in America. The concept of one nation under God is one that most Americans take for granted. But the story of how the phrase was coined and how it came to occupy such a central role in the national imagination has never really been explored in full. Now, its rough origins are clear, with the words rooted in the almost sacred text of the Gettysburg Address. When he delivered that famous speech, President Abraham Lincoln inserted a spontaneous but still a solemn prayer that after the war was over, quote, "This nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom." After Lincoln, however, that phrase largely disappeared from American political discourse. In the traditional story, it suddenly reappeared in the 1950s, almost a century later, plucked out of obscurity and thrown into the Pledge of Allegiance in a sudden burst of religious revival. According to the standard story, as America fell under the thrall of the anti-communist panic of the McCarthy era, the nation's leaders sought to emphasize America's religious traits as a way to distinguish America from the, quote, godless communists of the Soviet Union. In this telling, the religious nationalism of the 1950s was little more than a bit of Cold War propaganda that could easily be cast aside in ensuing decades. My current work, however, suggests something a little different. I'm seeking to demonstrate that in the post-war religious revival in general, and in the specific edition of this phrase, under God in particular, these were rooted not in the foreign policy panic of the 1950s, but rather in the domestic politics of the 1930s and 1940s. During those decades, as I'll talk about today, corporate titans enlisted conservative religious leaders to create a new era of religious nationalism. Together, they advanced a new ideology known as freedom under God that was meant to contrast with and challenge the state power that its architects feared most. And the government they feared most was not the Soviet regime in Moscow, but the New Deal administration in Washington, D.C. Now, from the earliest days of the New Deal, corporate America mounted a major campaign to restore the image of big business and to roll back what they called the creeping socialism of the New Deal state. Early in the Roosevelt administration, one business leader noted, "The public does not understand industry because industry itself has made no effort to tell its story, to show the people of this country that our high living standards have risen up almost altogether from the civilization which industry has set up." So corporate leaders resolved to change that through a massive campaign of what they called public relations, what their critics always called propaganda. They did this through their organizations that they had themselves and through new organizations that they created solely for this purpose. In 1934, for instance, a new generation of conservative industrialists took over the leadership of the National Association of Manufacturers, known as NAM for short. They took it over with promises of, quote, serving the purposes of business salvation. The powerful industrial organization dedicated itself now to spreading the gospel of free enterprise. The amount of money they poured into this was impressive. In 1934, their public relations budget was a paltry $34,000. 3 years later, in 1937, they were spending $800,000, a sum that represented more than half of all their funds. Now, NAM used that money to promote free enterprise through a wide array of films, radio programs, paid advertisements, direct mailings, a speakers bureau, and a press service that provided pre-made editorials and news stories for 7,500 local newspapers. In the end, however, The organization's efforts at self-promotion were seen as precisely that. And as an historian of NAM noted, its arguments were so clearly self-serving that, quote, it was easy for critics to dismiss the entire effort as mere propaganda. At the same time, corporate leaders created entirely new organizations designed solely for this purpose of selling the public on the virtues of free enterprise. The most prominent of these was the American Liberty League, a group that was founded also in 1934. Its purposes were, quote, to teach the necessity of respect for the rights of persons and property and the duty of government to protect individual initiative and free enterprise. The organization benefited immensely from the generous financial backing of corporate figures, particularly from organizations like DuPont and General Motors. But again, their prominent role in the group essentially crippled the organization, as the Liberty League, like NAM, was easily dismissed as another organization of tycoons looking out for their own self-interest. Jim Farley, the head of the Democratic Party at the time, famously joked that they should call the American Liberty League the American Cellophane League, because number one, it's a DuPont product, and number two, you can see right through it. Realizing that they could never effectively make a case for free enterprise on their own, these businessmen made the shrewd decision to outsource the job. But they chose a rather unlikely group to serve as their champions. They chose the clergy. Now, while it seemed like an unorthodox decision, the reason was simple. As the oil tycoon J. Howard Pugh noted to a fellow CEO, corporate leaders needed to enlist clergymen because, quote, recent polls indicated that of all groups in America, ministers have more to do with molding public opinion than any other group. They were much more popular than business leaders, to be sure, but also as men of God. They could advance corporate criticism of the New Deal without the suspicion that they were motivated by self-interest. But it was one thing to want clergymen to join this cause, and another to get them to actually join it. As early as 1940, the National Association of Manufacturers was engaged in a massive campaign intended to educate ministers about what they called the, quote, spiritual concept that underlies our American way of life. But again, the NAM campaign came off as nothing more than self-serving propaganda. In 1945, they hired an industrial consultant to figure out why, after 5 years of lobbying, they hadn't been able to win ministers over to their cause. He interviewed dozens of priests and rabbis and ministers across the country and found them almost unanimously repulsed by the campaign. The consultant's report noted that, quote, one of the men put it almost typically for the rest when he said, "We cannot help but see that this is expertly designed propaganda and that there must be big money behind it. We easily become suspicious." Accordingly, the industrialists decided they needed a go-between. They needed to find one minister who could lead the cause on their behalf and remove their fingerprints from the activities they were doing. They found him in a man named Reverend James W. Fifield, Jr. Now, Reverend Fifield had been ministering to the needs of the rich and powerful since 1935, when he became the pastor of the posh First Congregational Church in Los Angeles. This was a massive church. It had a 176-foot-tall Gothic tower, 3 gymnasiums, an auditorium. They hired a drama teacher from Yale to come lead their local plays. It was not a place that was short on money. In fact, the church included so many of the city's leading businessmen that one observer noted that, quote, its roster reads like the Wall Street Journal. Fifield warmly embraced his new flock, becoming, in the words of one admiring profile, the apostle to millionaires. Now, to be sure, Fifield was the perfect match for the millionaires in his pew. In the apt words of one observer, Fifield was, quote, one of the most theologically liberal and at the same time politically conservative ministers of his era. Theologically liberal, he had no patience for fundamentalists who insisted upon a literal reading of Scripture. Reading the Bible, he reasoned, should be, quote, like eating fish. We take the bones out to enjoy the meat. All parts are not of equal value. Accordingly, he easily dismissed Christ's teachings on wealth and poverty and instead embraced more recent sociological theories about the compatibility of Christianity and capitalism. The blessings of capitalism come from God, he argued. A system that provides so much for the common good and happiness must flourish under the favor of the Almighty. Now, while Fifield took a loose approach to the Bible, he was a strict constructionist when it came to the Constitution. He believed that the expansion of the federal government during the New Deal was wholly unconstitutional. He warned that the, quote, unsound fiscal policies, confused thinking, and dangerous ideologies of the Roosevelt administration posed a dire threat to the American way of life. The churches must come to grips with freedom, he said in 1939, and the sooner the better. As it fought the, quote, restricting trends of pagan statism, the church would find natural allies in corporate America. Because, quote, business, like the church, is naturally interested in the preservation of basic freedom in this nation. Goodness and Christian ideals run proportionately high among businessmen, Fifield said. They need no defense, for with all their faults, they have given America within the last decade a world high in general economic well-being. And yet Fifield himself would lead that defense. Now, to lead this crusade of churches and corporations in defense of freedom, economic freedom, Fifield created a new organization that he called spiritual mobilization. Now, the credo of spiritual mobilization reflected the politics of Reverend Fifield and the millionaires he served. Quote, man being created free as a child of God has certain inalienable rights and responsibilities. The state must not be permitted to usurp them. It is the duty of the church to help protect them. Specifically, these rights were, quote, the liberty and dignity of the individual, in which freedom of choice, freedom of enterprise, and freedom of property were paramount. A spiritual mobilization was founded in 1935, but it didn't do much outside of the LA area until it caught the attention of some of the nation's leading businessmen. Several members of Fifield's congregation were well connected nationally, and they connected him with corporate leaders across the country. By the mid-1940s, spiritual mobilization's backers resembled, in the words of one observer, quote, a who's who of the conservative establishment. And within that group of conservatives, corporate leaders stood at the fore. Indeed, in 1945, for instance, the 24-man advisory committee behind spiritual mobilization included 3 men who had served as president of the United States Chamber of Commerce, including the then current president and the immediate past president. It also included leaders of other major business lobbies, banking associations, and major Wall Street firms. The organization received generous donations from the top corporations in the country: General Motors, Chrysler, Republic Steel, National Steel, International Harvester, Firestone Rubber, Sun Oil, Gulf Oil, Standard Oil of New Jersey, and Colgate-Palmolive Peat, to name just a few, gave what was at the time the maximum donation allowed by law that could still receive a tax-exempt status. On top of that, executives at these firms made generous donations from their personal accounts, and they encouraged their family members, their friends, their competitors, and their employees to do the same. The oil and shipbuilding magnate J. Howard Pugh, for instance, not only tapped into his own family's considerable fortune, but drew up a list of 158 other major corporate leaders in the country and contacted them personally to twist their arms for funds. As a result of the generous backing of such corporate leaders, spiritual mobilization had an annual budget in 1947 already of $270,000. It would go up every year. Eventually it would have what in today's money would be about $5 to $6 million a year. In exchange for this generous funding, these corporate leaders had finally found an effective champion for free enterprise. A decade earlier, remember, the organizations that these industrialists had formed and financed to challenge the New Deal had been easily dismissed. The American Liberty League, as I noted earlier, was roundly mocked by liberals, up to and including President Franklin Roosevelt. Soon after its creation, FDR told reporters that, quote, there are, in my opinion, 2 great commandments. One is to love God, the other to love your neighbor. But the 2 particular tenets of this new organization say you shall love God and forget your neighbor. And then he added, it sounded like the God they worship is called property. Now with spiritual mobilization, these same industrialists were able to turn the tables on their critics. The new organization argued quite explicitly, over and over again, that it was the New Deal that had broken all of the 10 Commandments. It asserted that the Roosevelt administration made a, quote, false idol out of the federal government and encouraged Americans to worship it rather than the Almighty. That this pagan statism caused Americans to covet what the wealthy possessed. It encouraged them to steal from the wealthy. And ultimately, that the New Deal bore false witness by telling Americans it could deliver much more than government ever could. Above all, they insisted that the welfare state was not a means to implement Christ's teachings about caring for the poor and the needy, but rather a perversion of his doctrine. In a forceful rejection of the public service themes that undergirded the social gospel teachings of the day, they argued repeatedly that the central tenet of Christianity remained the salvation of the individual. And if any economic system meshed with the teachings of Jesus Christ, therefore, it would have to be rooted in another individualistic ethos. And nothing better exemplified such values, they insisted, than the system of free enterprise. Thus, throughout the 1940s and the early 1950s, Reverend Fifield and like-minded religious leaders, including prominently Norman Vincent Peale, advanced a new blend of faith and free enterprise that one observer aptly anointed Christian libertarianism. A critic noted that Fifield and his allies, quote, do as much proselytizing for Adam Smith and the National Association for Manufacturers as they do for Christianity. But these figures, like Fifield, would have welcomed that jibe as a fair description of their work, even a compliment. For they saw Christianity and capitalism as thoroughly intertwined. They believed rather sincerely that spreading the gospel of one required spreading the gospel of the other. Now, in the late 1940s, Fifield managed to take this ideology of Christian libertarianism and reduce it, like all good political philosophies, to a bumper sticker style slogan. And this slogan was, freedom under God. Now, scholars would later assume that this phrase, freedom under God, was coined as a way solely to draw a contrast between the democratic and religious principles that undergirded American government with the godless communism of the Soviet Union. However, my study of the private correspondence of people like Fifield and the corporate leaders who funded his cause show pretty clearly that the main threat that they saw to the American way of life, again, was not Moscow, but Washington. For just a few examples, noting the sudden surge of support that spiritual mobilization had in its membership applications at the end of 1948 after Harry Truman's re-election, Reverend Fifield claimed that interest in the group stemmed from the fact that, quote, it is so obvious that the battle to collectivize America is really on, and on in earnest, ever since the announcement of President Truman's legislative program. His backers, like J. Howard Pugh, agreed. In 1950, for instance, Pugh noted that, quote, there are 5 principal issues before the country: the socialization of industry, the socialization of medicine, the socialization of education, the socialization of labor, and the socialization of security. If we lose on any one of these 5 fronts, it is only a question of time before we have lost them all. Only through education and the pressure which the people can exert on our own politicians can we hope to prevent this country from becoming a totalitarian state. Accordingly, spiritual mobilization used ample funding from its corporate sponsors to promote this ideology of freedom under God, to educate the American people about the godly nature of capitalism, and more importantly, to warn them about the pagan ways of the welfare state. They did this in a number of ways. First of all, in 1949, they launched a radio program called The Freedom Story. This free 15-minute program was fairly simple. It was a short, dramatic presentation, followed by a brief commentary by Fifield. Now, importantly, the broadcasts were marketed to radio stations as a way that they could fulfill their public service requirements in a way that would also attract listeners. This decision allowed the organization to secure free airtime, but it also importantly dictated changes in the content. In the original scripts, Fifield spent all of his time making direct attacks against the Truman administration. But his legal counsel warned that getting that directly involved in partisan politics would mean the program could not count as a public service, and they'd have to pay for the airtime. Instead of directly attacking the Democrats, he suggested, they should use, quote, a horrible example from current experience in the socialist and communist countries of Europe and Asia. And then later on, quote, make it plain enough to your radio audience in your commentary that we are heading to the same kind of situation here. Within a year, Fifield's radio programs about the danger of creeping socialism at home and abroad were being played on a weekly network of over 500 radio stations. At the same time, Spiritual Mobilization launched a new monthly magazine titled Faith and Freedom. The magazine printed and promoted the work of an expanding network of libertarian and conservative authors. To name just a few of the conservative all-stars that appeared in this magazine It printed Ludwig von Mises, famed leader of the Austrian School of Economics. Leonard Read, founder of the Foundation for Economic Education. Henry Hazlitt, a founding member of the American Enterprise Institute. Clarence Mannion, former dean of law at Notre Dame, who became a noted right-wing radio host in the 1950s. Felix Morley, founder of the far-right journal Human Events. Karl Hess, a conservative speechwriter who gained fame on the 1964 Barry Goldwater presidential campaign. And Rose Wilder Lane, and my favorite example, who co-wrote the Little House on a Prairie series with her mother, Laura Ingalls Wilder, before attacking the creeping socialism of the New Deal in her own fiction. Now, taken together, the Freedom Story radio show and the Faith and Freedom magazine helped disseminate this ideology of freedom under God to an ever-expanding national audience. In 1951, though, the organization hit upon its best idea yet. To mark that summer's anniversary, the 175th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, they proposed arranging a massive series of events for the week surrounding the 4th of July on the theme of freedom under God. According to Fifield's longtime ally, William Mullendore, who was president of the Southern California Edison Company, the idea originated from the belief that, quote, the root cause of disintegration of freedom here and of big government is the disintegration of the nation's spiritual foundations, as found in the Declaration of Independence. We want to revive that basic American credo, which is the spiritual basis of our country. Therefore, in June 1951, the leaders of spiritual mobilization announced that they would form a new, quote, committee to proclaim liberty that would coordinate their 4th of July celebrations. The committee's name, they explained to a crowd of reporters, came from the 10th verse of the 25th chapter of the book of Leviticus, in which God instructed Moses that the Israelites should celebrate the anniversary of their arrival in the Promised Land and, quote, proclaimed liberty throughout all the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. This piece of scripture, the promoters like to point out, was inscribed on the crown of the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. Now, the ranks of the committee would soon blow way out of proportion, but originally it included just 56 members in an effort to mimic the number of signers of the Declaration of Independence. Now, although they claimed that they were trying to seek a spiritual emphasis on the 4th of July, it's important to note that very few religious leaders actually served in its ranks. Aside from Reverend Fifield and his close ally, Norman Vincent Peale, the founding ministerial members of the committee included only a Methodist bishop, a Catholic bishop from the Oklahoma City, Tulsa Diocese, and a rabbi from Kansas City. The main thrust of the committee to proclaim liberty was to advance modern conservatism. The members whose presence on the committee were emphasized the most in their PR materials were two prominent opponents of democratic administrations. Former President Herbert Hoover, who had been driven from the White House by Roosevelt 2 decades earlier, and General Douglas MacArthur, who had been driven out of the military 2 months earlier by Harry Truman. Now, Hoover and MacArthur were joined by other people like military leaders like General Mark Clark, the heads of patriotic groups like the heads of the American Legion, conservative media luminaries of the day like newspaper columnist George Sokolowski, radio broadcaster Fulton Lewis Jr., Human Events founder Felix Morley, leading conservative voices in the realm of law like Clarence Mannion and Dean Roscoe Pound of Harvard, and also famous conservatives from the entertainment world like Bing Crosby, Cecil B. DeMille, Walt Disney, and the actor Ronald Reagan. The dominant presence on the Committee to Proclaim Liberty, however, came from the corporate world. J. Howard Pugh, whose family had donated about 1/10 of the $100,000 operating budget for the committee, served as a founding member. He was joined by a number of other corporate giants, including Conrad Hilton of Hilton Hotels, B.E. Hutchinson of Chrysler, James L. Kraft of Kraft Foods, Houston McBain of the Marshall Field Department Stores, Eddie Rickenbacker of Eastern Airlines, and Charles E. Wilson of General Motors. The interest of leading businessmen in the endeavor was so strong, in fact, with so many clamoring for a spot, that they had to make room for many more, including Harvey Firestone, E.F. Hutton, Fred Maytag, Henry Luce, and J.C. Penney. They also brought in the lesser well-known heads of U.S. Steel, Republic Steel, Gulf Oil, Hughes Aircraft, and United Airlines. This massive corporate presence was reinforced by the heads of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, as well as leaders of free enterprise advocacy groups, like the Foundation for Economic Education and the Freedoms Foundation. As a token counterweight to this overwhelming corporate presence, to give some semblance of balance, they included a single individual identified as a, quote, labor leader. It was Matthew Wohl, who was a vice president of the American Federation of Labor, but also a lifelong Republican, known for his outspoken opposition to industrial unions and New Deal labor legislation. He was the perfect labor leader, the one who thought there was no need for labor legislation. Now, as the 4th of July drew near, the Committee to Proclaim Liberty focused all of its attention on encouraging Americans to mark the holiday with public readings of the preamble of the Declaration. Now, the decision to focus on the preamble, and the preamble only, was in some ways a natural one, as its passages are certainly the most famous and the most lyrical of the document. But more importantly, doing so allowed the organizers to frame the Declaration as a purely libertarian manifesto, dedicated to the removal of an oppressive government. Those who read the entire document, however, would have discovered, to the consternation of the committee, that the Founding Fathers had followed this high-flown prose of the preamble with a long list of grievances about the absence of government in their lives and the rule of law in the colonial era. Among other things, they lambasted King George III for refusing, quote, his assent to laws, which are most wholesome and necessary for public good, for forbidding governors from passing laws of immediate and pressing importance, from dissolving legislative bodies in the colonies, and generally enabling a state of lawlessness and anarchy that exposed the colonists to, quote, all dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. In the end, the Declaration of Independence was not a rejection of government power, but rather a condemnation of the ways in which the British Crown had deprived the colonists of the government they so badly needed. In order to reframe the Declaration as something rather different, the Committee to Proclaim Liberty had to edit out much of the document they claimed to champion. Indeed, the committee offered its own interpretation of the Declaration of Independence. This was spelled out clearly in full-page ads that ran in major newspapers by corporate sponsors. Many of these sponsors were utility companies. San Diego Gas and Electric Company, for instance, ran ads in Southern California papers encouraging its customers to reread the preamble on the 4th. And it presented the preamble with its editorial commentary running alongside. These are the stones upon which man has built history's greatest work, the United States of America. Remember them well. All men are created equal. That means you are as important in the eyes of God as any man brought into this world. You are made in his image and likeness. There is no superior man anywhere. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Here is your birthright, the freedom to live, work, worship, and vote as you choose. There are no rights government may take away from you. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Here is the reason and the purpose for government. Government is but a servant, not a master, not a giver of anything, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. In America, the government may assume only the powers you allow it to have. It may assume no others. The ad urged readers to make their own Declaration of Independence in 1951. Declare that government is responsible to you and not for you. Declare that freedom is more important to you than, and these are in scare quotes, freedom is more important to you than security or survival. Declare that rights God gave to you may not be taken away by any government for any purpose. Other utility companies offered similar advertisements in local newspapers with their own spin. Detroit Edison, for instance, quoted extensively from an article by Clarence Mannion that had originally been published by the Heritage Foundation. This is full of scare quotes as well. Despotism never advertises itself as such, he warned. By its own sly self-definition, it may label itself democratic, progressive, liberal, humanitarian, or fraternal. Those who oppose it will be called reactionaries, fascist, or other bad names. I love that fascist doesn't get the scare quotes. The Utah Power and Light Company, meanwhile, cut right to the chase, running a full-page ad in the Salt Lake newspapers with the alarmist headline, "How many Independence Days do we have left?" The power company implored readers to, quote, pray for help in maintaining man's closeness to God and preserving man's God-given rights and responsibilities against those who would make you dependent on a socialistic, all-powerful central government. Now, while it was not surprising to hear corporations speak in this language, the whole point of spiritual mobilization was to get ministers to say these things. So it should come as no surprise that the Committee to Proclaim Liberty enlisted the nation's ministers to promote the freedom under God theme in a variety of ways. The most important way was a sermon contest they established. The 17,000 ministers who belonged to the organization were encouraged to compete for cash prizes and other rewards by writing an original sermon on the theme of freedom under God. And they should preach it to their own congregations on what they called Independence Sunday, July 1st, 1951. And on Independence Sunday, tens of thousands of clergymen offered sermons on this theme. Now, because the contest was limited only to ministers who actively belonged to the organization, the sermons invariably sounded the themes near and dear to their hearts. The effort to establish socialism in our country has probably progressed farther than most of us realize, asserted a Lutheran minister in Kansas. It will be well to remember that every act or law passed by the government which promises to give us something is a step in the direction of socialism. A clergyman from Brooklyn agreed. Today our homes are built for us, financed for us, and the church is provided for us. Many services are in danger of robbing us of that which is most important, the right to our own kingdom of self. A Missouri Baptist warned, the growing acceptance of the philosophy of the welfare state is a graver peril to freedom in America today than the threat of military aggression abroad. A Congregationalist minister in Illinois advanced the same argument. People have been encouraged to believe that a benevolent government exists for the sole purpose of ministering to the selfish interest of the individual. We have achieved the four freedoms, he said, mocking FDR's war aims. The freedom to ask, the freedom to receive, the freedom to be a leech, and the freedom to loaf. Now, the prize for first place in the sermon competition went to Reverend Kenneth Sollitt, who was pastor of the First Baptist Church of Mendota, Illinois. Appropriately, his sermon bore the title, Freedom Under God. We can go on making a God of government, or we can return again to the government of God. As you can tell from the title, it represented an extended Jeremiad about the sins of the welfare state. Reverend Sollitt took time to decry the national debt, growing federal payrolls, corporate taxation, government bureaucracy in general, and Social Security in particular, while still finding time and imagination to use the parable of the Good Samaritan as grounds for a long diatribe about the evils of socialized medicine. With the dire tones of an Old Testament prophet, he warned that, quote, America stands at the crossroads. The one road leads to the slavery, which has always been the lot of those who have chosen collectivism in any of its forms, he said, be it communism, socialism, or the welfare state. They're all cut from the same cloth. The other road leads to the only freedom there is, free enterprise. The New Deal, he argued, had destroyed America's character. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, has become government of the people by pressure groups for the benefit of minorities. Give me liberty or give me death, he said, has been shortened to just gimme. Now, these individual sermons preached on Independence Sunday were linked together and amplified by a program broadcast that same evening over CBS's national radio network. The committee had originally hoped to schedule the broadcast for the 4th of July itself, but it missed its chance by organizing at a late date. Again, they only got rolling about a month before the 4th. All they accomplished is incredibly impressive. But they organized so late that all the broadcast time on the 4th itself had been claimed. As one organizer complained, even if we had the Lord himself making a return appearance, we couldn't get the airtime. So they quickly warmed to the idea of holding a special program on Sunday night instead. They did this both to highlight the spiritual emphasis of the festivities and to build on the momentum of all of the sermons delivered that day. The national advertising firm of J. Walter Thompson handled the PR for the program. But organizers believed that a less professional word of mouth from the pulpit would be even more effective. There will be a couple 100,000 ministers across the country who will have had direct word about this program, and many of them will definitely be cooperative, an organizer noted. There will be 30 to 40 million people in church that Sunday as usual, and we'll pick them up just a few hours afterwards. Now, the program itself lived up to the organizers' expectations. A longtime friend of Reverend Fifield, Cecil B. DeMille, met with him personally to plan the production in order to give the event a professional, polished tone and to stock it with an impressive array of Hollywood stars. Jimmy Stewart served as the on-air master of ceremonies, while Bing Crosby and Gloria Swanson offered short messages of their own. The preamble to the Declaration of Independence was read by the famed actor Lionel Barrymore, who had earlier posed for promotional photos holding a giant quill in front of a piece of parchment that said, "Freedom under God will save our country." The program featured choral performances of America, as well as Heritage, which was an epic poem composed by a former executive of the United States Chamber of Commerce. I've got a quote from it. The song, later reprised as the program's finale, stressed the centrality of individual initiative in American history. Here's a sampling. My fathers had been well content as they subdued a continent, with axe and plow and gun and knife, with axe and plow and gun and knife, with axe and plow and gun and knife, to see the labor they had spent bear fruit in such a way of life, bear fruit in such a way of life, bear fruit in such a way of life. I can only imagine sung it would have moved you to tears. The keynote address, meanwhile, came from General Matthew Ridgway, who interrupted his duties leading American forces in Korea to offer a live address from Tokyo. In keeping with the program's theme of freedom under God, the general insisted that the founding fathers had been motivated in large part by their religious faith. For them, there was no confusion of thought, no uncertainty of objectives, no doubt as to the road they should follow to their goals, he said. Theirs was a deep and abiding faith in God, a faith which is still the great reservoir of strength of the American people in this day of great responsibility for their future and the future of the world. Now, 3 days later, the Freedom Under God festivities reached their natural conclusion with local celebrations on the 4th of July. The Committee to Proclaim Liberty coordinated the ringing of church bells across the nation, timed to start precisely at noon and last for 10 full minutes. Cities and small towns across the country scheduled their own events around the bell ringing. In Los Angeles, for instance, the city's civil defense agency tested the city's air raid sirens for the very first time, just before noon, in what one newspaper described as a, quote, scream as wild and proud as that of the American eagle. As the bells chimed across the city at noon, residents were encouraged to, quote, open their doors, sound horns, and blow whistles and ring bells as individual salutes to freedom. After 10 minutes of ringing, groups gathered in churches and homes to read the preamble to the Declaration together. LA's mayor, Fletcher Bowron, and California's governor, Earl Warren, like their counterparts in many other cities and states, issued official proclamations at request of the committee, urging citizens, in Earl Warren's proclamation, to spend the day reflecting upon, quote, the blessings we enjoy through freedom under God. That night, then, 50,000 residents attended a massive rally at the Los Angeles Coliseum. Organized under the theme, Freedom Under God Needs You, the night featured 8 circus acts, a jet plane demonstration, and a fireworks display that the local chapter of the American Legion promised would be the largest in the entire country. Reverend Fifield had the honor of offering the invocation for the evening ceremonies, while the actor Gregory Peck delivered a dramatic reading of the preamble of the Declaration of Independence. In the end, the Committee to Proclaim Liberty believed, rightfully, that its work and the work of spiritual mobilization in general had made a lasting impression on the nation. The organizers concluded, quote, the very words freedom under God have added to the vocabulary of freedom a new term. The term provides means of identifying and separating conditions which indicate pseudo-freedom or actual slavery from those of true freedom. Citing an outpouring of support from the festivities, the committee resolved to make it an annual tradition, and more important, work to keep the spirit of the central message alive in American life. The entire nation, they hoped, would soon think of itself as under God. And indeed, the nation did. In 1952, the next year, the 4th of July was once again marked with massive celebrations on the Freedom Under God theme. But this time the events took on an added significance. Earlier that year, Congress had passed a new law mandating the celebration of the country's first official National Day of Prayer, with a date to be chosen by the President. Following the lead of spiritual mobilization, Harry Truman picked the 4th of July. His successor in the White House, Dwight Eisenhower, did even more to cement the phrase of a national consciousness and to spread the philosophy of what they were calling under God consciousness. Shortly after taking office in 1953, in his first week in office, in fact, Eisenhower presided over the very first presidential prayer breakfast, an event whose official theme was government under God. His administration took that motto to heart, instituting new practices such as opening prayers at cabinet meetings and encouraging prayer throughout the executive branch. The next year, Congress followed his lead by formally adding under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. 2 years later, they made a similar phrase, "In God we trust," into the nation's first official motto. As a political culture of public religion moved to center stage during the Eisenhower era, the new religious nationalism eroded the underlying arguments of the New Deal precisely as the architects of the phrase had intended. It successfully recast capitalism in the most favorable light imaginable as the teachings of Christ, while encouraging Americans to question the validity and value of the welfare state as a pagan thought. More fundamentally, however, this movement of under God consciousness succeeding in convincing a wide range of Americans that the country was at heart a Christian nation. The prayers of corporate America had been answered, but in ways that went beyond their wildest imagination. Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.